Welcome to this episode of Lead the Machine podcast, where today's leaders and tomorrow's talk about the human side of AI at work. I'm Kirsten Marr, your host, and looking forward to having an important conversation on the current state of building teams and the role of AI in recruiting with Jessica Peskin. Jessica is a two-time founder and the CEO of Global Recruiters of Denver, an executive search firm that helps growth companies build smartly by hiring the leaders and teams that drive modern, profitable insurance organizations. Her people-centered instincts carried her through an unconventional but deeply operational path. She owned and operated a real estate company. I mean, this woman's done a lot. She has adjusted fire losses, built licensing and compliance teams, developed agency and carrier distribution, which essentially means how you market and sell insurance policies, and help grow a ground up SaaS, software as a service, insurtech agency. She has lived the work from the desk level to the executive level, which gives her a rare operator's lens on the challenges companies face when they try to scale and when they try to implement new technologies. So, Jessica founded her recruiting firm to modernize recruiting with data driven insight, thoughtful discovery, and human centered coaching. This is particularly important in the age of AI, which, my opinion, my belief, is a complete fail when it comes to recruiting. Why do I say that? I don't think either side is getting what they need. Candidates feel lost, employers are overwhelmed by the amount of submissions that they get. I think we've gone way too far in taking the human out of the equation and erasing a candidate's ability to stand out and show creativity in how they show up to a potential employer. And Jessica is just the best, most wonderful resource to engage in this conversation. She works as an embedded partner to help companies build intentionally, elevate leadership capacity, and strengthen culture. She is a member of the National Insurance Recruiting Association and serves on the executive committee for InsurTech Denver, where she supports community building and forward-looking conversations around talent and innovation. Personal passion of mine. She's also a candid voice on what is breaking in today's recruiting pipeline. After participating in nearly 500 interviews, she teaches professionals how to communicate clearly, build trust quickly, and navigate a hiring landscape that is increasingly shaped by automation. Jessica, welcome to Lead the Machine. I'm so glad to have you. I'd like to start off with you telling us what inspired you to launch Global Recruiters of Denver. What is the gap that you saw that you wanted to fill?
Well, first, hi, Kirsten. Thanks for having me. Important topics. I'm so glad to get to talk about it. I think what drove me into the recruiting space was, first of all, something that I was not seeking and had no idea that I would land in this channel. But I was going through my own job change, and I was a little surprised at how limited the resources were for job seekers. And not so much that I couldn't find a recruiter or someone to rebuild my resume and other paid services, but I really didn't have a guide. I was looking for a guide. I was looking for someone who could help me understand what the landscape looked like, someone who could help me maybe tie my story to a job just a little bit more closely. And I was a little disappointed that there weren't as many resources as I had imagined because it was the first time I was in that spot.
What patterns stood out that changed the way that you coach candidates on one side, And on the other side, how you think companies should hire.
Well, I saw a lot of patterns for sure. And you're right. The first couple of years of the pandemic, I was hosting interviews for my clients and candidates to try and just take something off their plate, make it easier because everybody was struggling with a lot of different problems they were trying to solve during that time. And so I started to notice patterns in candidates in how they showed up to the interview, how they answered questions. But most importantly, I think the biggest thing was how they told their story. Um, they were trying to tell their story to meet the job description. They were trying to match their background to the pattern of what the responsibilities and the requirements were for the job. And so I encouraged them to take a step back and kind of start from the fundamentals. And so by doing that, I would ask them to tell me their story. But I did it in a little bit of a different way. I asked them to record it, or I asked them to use the dictation feature on their phone and just kind of freewheel a little bit. I called it stream of consciousness. Just talk as if you're talking to a friend and walk through your background and what you learned and how you added things to your toolbox over time. So I started to try and coach from that space to say, here's what your real story is. I would hear their dictation or I would hear their recording and I would hear them pause in certain areas because they didn't know how to tie their story together. And they
Mm.
would often have a really great story to tell. I mean, their experience was all over. I mean, they solved a lot of issues up and down the value chain often, but they didn't know how to put that into a little bit of an elevator pitch to be able to share with an interviewer. So I think that's the first thing I tried to hone in on was how to tell a story better. And from the hiring perspective, I would encourage hiring managers to kind of dig further into that first part of the interview rather than just jump right into the questions. Sometimes I would observe an interview and the hiring manager wouldn't even introduce themselves. They wouldn't tell their story and they would just say, I've got a copy of your resume. We're going to jump right in. And they would just jump right into the questions. And it's a key component to understanding who's on the other side of the screen and or desk, wherever you're interviewing.
And what do you think is broken in today's AI powered recruiting systems?
I think we're over indexing people.
Mhm.
I think we're trying to use an underwriting triage model, if you will. We're trying to match buzzwords on a resume with buzzwords in a job description. We're trying to see that the candidate matches the job perfectly. And some candidates do. I'm not saying that that doesn't happen, but I think more often than not, you're looking for the best candidate for the job. And that's not always going to be in the language that they use on their resume. I think more often it's not about what's on their resume. It's probably what's not on their resume most often. So I think we're using kind of that predictive index that we might use in a personality test, which I also think can be overdone, to identify a perfect candidate from the beginning. And I think that the biggest problem I see is that I will talk to a candidate who will say, I've applied to 100 jobs in the past 6 weeks. And not only will they not have heard back from anyone, but they'll get a lot of declination letters and they know they're a perfect fit for the role. And they've never even talked to a person. So
And
I just think
a person maybe not have seen their resume.
yes, exactly. A machine looked at it. They decided. So going back to my, underwriting analogy, we're just triaging great talent out of the process early on, way early on.
And how much of that do you think is attributed to the rise of AI generated resumes and job descriptions that then lead the machine, that's looking at it to affect both sides of the hiring equation?
Yeah. Well, I think it turns everything real vanilla and real black and white. And it totally eliminates the opportunity to showcase a personality and the humanality of people that I think is really the true ingredient that helps us solve business problems. We need humans for strategy, not AI. And so I think we're kind of applying it that way. I think we have candidates that are building resumes in AI as they should use an
Mhm.
AI tool, I think, to help them kind of get their thoughts organized, kind of create some order to chaos around their story or their background. And we've got hiring managers who are building a job description based on the same kind of application. And now we have AI talking to AI. We've totally lost the human element. And I don't know, if you've had this experience, but I certainly have. When I'm working with an AI tool, unless I have my settings right, unless I've really prompted it the right way, I'm often going to get a conversation that agrees with most of what I say.
Oh,
And
it loves
so
to compliment us.
it sure does. And so I think it can also give a false sense of match as well. I mean, you have an AI written job description, maybe even an AI business process, reading an AI written candidate resume. I just don't know you're getting the real story on either side. I don't think you really understand the job or the individual at that point.
So let's net this out. What is your assessment of the pitfalls that are really preventing companies from finding the right people to join their team?
Yeah. And I agree with you. I think that we have a systemic problem, not a talent problem. There's phenomenal talent out there, more of it than probably the industry can take in. So think
Mhm.
about that for a second. I talk to hiring managers all the time that say, I just can't find the right person, and they're sitting on 1,000 resumes. So I think we have to think about how we put the humanality at the front end of our recruiting. And I'm not here to say I have the silver bullet answer because I don't. It's a problem that we're all working through together. And I understand not every company can work with a recruiter. Not every company can have that intermediary to help make those connections. We can use AI tools to be able to better help pull out maybe where we think the match is the best on paper. You may have seen this story. This was sometime, I'm going to say last summer, last fall. There was a story that made its rounds on all the news publications because they were highlighting a story. And I hope I don't get some of the details wrong, but you'll get the gist. The hiring manager, I believe he was a VP, was looking for a very specific person to fill in his team's void. And it was actually a succession role, so it was even more important. And they had given all the details to their HR team. Their HR team, worked hard to try and find the right candidate. They were using some AI tools now, earlier adapters, obviously. But eventually, I think it was maybe 6 months down the road, they had had zero candidates that they moved through to have an interview with the VP. And so he thought to himself, I wonder if there's something in this process that's broken. And so he took his own resume, he changed his name and some identifying
And
factors,
applied.
and he applied for the job.
Oh, what happened?
Well, he didn't get a phone screen. So this
Was he just
story is
ignored? Did he get any response?
he got a declination. He got an
Whoa.
automated declination. And so he obviously brought this to their attention. And
Yeah.
I'm sure there were some big conversations around that. I don't know how the story
Yeah.
ends. But I think it really articulates the point that I'm trying to make, and that is if we keep going down the path of trying to match the right candidate with tools like AI and others, I think we're going to end up with fewer viable candidates, obviously. Look at the story.
Listen, I'm a data driven, gal. I run data analytics businesses for, the last decade. And yet we have to be honest when it's not serving the intention. And that's the whole point of using data analytics is to look at the data, look at what happens. And if it's working, keep doing more of it. And if it's
Right.
not, pivot. So now that we've thoroughly thrown a whole bucket of water on the current state of recruiting with AI, what do you think it would look like for companies that are using AI well in hiring, and where do you see potential if it's a little more thoughtfully implemented?
Yeah. I think AI is a great tool to drill down. I think it's a great tool to be able to kind of clear out some of the noise when it comes to this entire process. It can organize the chaos, like I said earlier. We've got hiring professionals, so hiring managers, HR teams, talent teams, all kind of programming their own wants into different tools to get what they're looking for. And I think that we need to lean into how we're making those, I guess, settings align with what we're trying to achieve.
Mhm.
And I'll just give one example. I recruit in a lot of different channels for insurance, but one of them is underwriting. I recruit for a lot of underwriting positions, and I always think of underwriters as, a bit of the master of ceremonies when it comes to insurance. And so an underwriter has to be able to assess a lot of different factors about a risk. And I think it's very similar to a hiring manager there or HR, whoever's leading the charge in recruiting. I think we have to assess a lot of different things about candidates. And I think back to my days of being an underwriter a long time ago. And I remember thinking the company that I work for was a big driver into this method for me. But I remember hearing we have to look for the risks that we want, even if there are signs or elements of the risk that would normally kick it out of contention. And I try to think about how we apply that. We're able to apply it to risk. We should be able to apply it to hiring. How can we program our tools to be able to also identify that gray area that we want to explore? And I don't know what the answer is on how to do that, but I think that's where we need to drive. I think we need to be able to make our tools not necessarily more sentient, but at least more open to and more driven to give us results that maybe fall into a gray area. And maybe those are the people you pick up the phone and you have a discussion with. Maybe
Mhm.
they're not the black and white perfect match, but I think there's a gray area in there that maybe we're just leaving off the table.
Well, and we often coach people, hey, if you had one job and you're trying to grow your career, what are your transferable skills that can go into another career? And sometimes those are the best matches, and we're not allowing that to bubble up because they're never gonna get through a keyword search.
Yeah.
Right, because they don't have that unless they fake their resume in order to get a phone screen, and then that's not what you want either. So I love what you're saying about like how do we allow the gray area, which honestly is where so many of us have built our careers, is in the gray area. There's never this straight line, unless you have a very kind of technical degree where it's a very straight line that you kind of
Mhm.
most of us have this. We did this, we studied that, we
Right.
went here, we went there. It's the
Yeah.
gray area. It's the gray area. And so the gray area is where a lot of the magic can like happen and the right people can join your team. So I'll put you in the hot seat. So I'm gonna say that right now you're the head of HR for an organization, and these AI tools are in place, and they can't just be easily just ripped out and shut down. How do you bring back the gray area? What would you start thinking about in terms of bringing more connection and clarity into the process of bringing on the right awesome people?
Mhm. I think it's the what else. You know, anybody who's ever been in a business meeting with me knows that that's like a famous quip that comes out of my mouth. What else? What are we not thinking about? What else can we, add to this? And I think it's really in that space. Let's go back to the example that I gave before of someone who might have been indexed out by an AI tool and leaning into what that gray area might be. I think we have to have discussions of what's the gray area. Where are areas where a candidate could come in from another channel, another discipline in your industry and bring great value to the role at hand? I talked about underwriters. Um, Claims people can make excellent underwriters in my world in insurance because they know what to look for in certain areas. Those are great transferable roles. And so I think that's a good example of how we identify what those gray areas could be. I think we have to rely on tools for some things, and we're not going to be able to phone screen every applicant who comes across our desks ever, especially in this world now. I don't think we're going back to that place. So we have to lean into more of what that gray area could be. What's an outlier that we should consider that might come into our funnel for this job? And
Mhm.
how would we approach that candidate differently than what we might for somebody who's a perfect match or a black and white bad match?
Yeah. And then let's layer on this idea of culture because you can look at someone for skills and experience, but as we all know, right, culture is such an important part of the
Mhm.
hiring process. I don't even know how culture even gets a shot at when it's so automated. What's your thought around that part of the gray area, which is could this be a real cultural fit or not?
Yeah. Yeah, and we have tools that we use for cultural fit. Companies are certainly using questionnaires and different indexing tools that I think are worthwhile. But you're not going to be able to determine, grit, EQ, things that are not going to be able to surface, let's say, in a resume, but maybe might be able to discern through some sort of an index or a questionnaire. I think we need to think about how we're writing those questions differently and what we're really trying to identify for our culture. I do see some companies do this really well. And so
Mhm.
I think you can screen for culture in certain tests like that. I think that it's going to be a precursor to a conversation always. So again, kind of leaning into back to that gray area, I think we need to think outside of what is just the general job wants. I think we need to think bigger than that. When we're writing our job descriptions, when we're screening, when we're programming our tools to look for certain attributes and elements, if someone has some of your base fundamentals that you're looking for, how can we screen that same candidate and ask them questions to determine if they are that cultural fit, and how do those tools work together alongside of the humans, and making sure that we bring that uniquely human kind of conversation into the mix. Where's that drop off point where we see our talent pools just kind of becoming leaner than we would like? That's where I think you lean into that type of approach.
I like that. And what I would add, having hired so many people and cultural fit being so, so important. Um, and in my case, what we were looking for a lot of times was the experience of the industry that we were in, but someone who would be okay in more of an entrepreneurial startup environment. And I mean, to your point, there's screening tools, but you have to get to the point of screening them. I'm saying, I think we got to think about before declining a resume only on keywords for the skills, I would learn how to look at a resume and figure out if they had the right cultural makeup to
Mm-hmm.
even be worth a conversation. And I would never have gotten there if I simply looked at the companies that they worked at and their titles. You had to
Right.
look at the bullets underneath to say what kind of projects were they on? Were they
Mm-hmm.
doing startup projects within large complex organizations, as an example? Well, if you're doing that, you have to have a certain entrepreneurial spirit. But if you're not screening for that, you could be declining people just based on skills and keywords and completely losing the fact that they might be a really great cultural fit if you're looking for people who have had to figure it out on their own, have had to do a bunch of, work that only those detailed bullets and you looking at it, you would glean, oh, this person looks like they've had a career that isn't going to work here. But when you really look at it, they could end up being exact, especially when you're trying to find a very experienced worker, a certain kind of skill set that can be hard to find. So I think there's also opportunity to figure out how do we screen for culture before we just decline on skills-based keywords, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. And it also kind of brings me to the other side of this, and that's the candidate experience. Candidates are using AI tools too. And
Mhm.
again, I think they should in most cases. But what I see is candidates are using an AI tool to spit out a resume, and that's it. That's what they're submitting. That's what they're uploading online. That's what they're providing to hiring managers. And it's just so agnostic. It's kind of meant to fit so many different things, and it doesn't really tell their true story either. So I encourage candidates on the other side of this to be able to tell their story on their resume. Going back to your point, looking to find that culture match and looking at what a candidate's background is, where they've worked, what kind of projects they've worked on. I encourage candidates to almost sort of jump out of that perfectly poised
Mhm.
resume and tell a real story through your resume. I tell candidates something that I think surprises some people, and that is tell a story about a failure on your resume.
Mhm.
I think you can learn so much about a person and how they respond to something that didn't work out. And so those stories are often more relevant than the buzzword match.
Really? That's super interesting to me. You actually coach them to put it on the resume.
I do.
How
Yeah.
many people do it?
A lot. I would
Wow.
say I do it in a strategic way. I say, tell your story through your resume, but make sure you showcase something that you overcame in a way. And being able to be successful and overcoming a situation isn't always getting to the answer that you were seeking. It's not always coming to the closure of that project you were put on, but to tell what happened in the outcome overall. Maybe you learned something that was hugely impactful to a project you did in the future based on a failure that you had earlier in your career. That's really meaningful. It shows grit. It shows that that person's not afraid of going back to it, trying again, using new lessons. Um, my failures are important. Even just the
Yeah.
little stuff that happens to us every day, we're learning all day long. And I don't think we put a lot of energy into unpacking that, although I think we should. So they do. They kind of look at me a little odd at the beginning, but once I kind of explain and unpack what I'm trying to get to, they get it. And in a way, we're trying to take the old approach of giving a cover letter that tells a lot about us and who we are and why we want the job and why we think your company is great, and we're trying to somehow insert that into our resume because we're so often just putting it into an algorithm online or passing a resume to a friend or whatever it may be. So we're really trying to build that resume to be a better storyteller. And AI is not able to do that. It's able to organize you in a good way, but it can't tell your story the way that you can.
That is so cool. And so I think in talking with you, part of your practice, in addition to putting a fail on your resume, which I just love that takeaway. That's so cool. But is, how do you help candidates when they do get through the AI, they get to, the phone interviews, how do you reinforce the power of storytelling, authenticity, and self-awareness?
Do a lot of interview coaching, which is a really interesting thing. It's just the dynamic is something that I haven't experienced. It's just a very different type of conversation with someone because it's a very vulnerable one for the candidate to come in and say, I'm good at this during an interview, not so great at this. And everybody's got their own interview story. And some people will say, I've never had to interview. Someone's come after me every time. So that's an interesting one to tackle as well. But that dynamic is one that it involves a lot of trust and it involves a lot of balance and finesse on my part because what you're trying to do is make sure that a candidate can lean into their story and tell it well and be able to tell the story in the way that I see it through my lens in my deep conversation with them and be able to share that with a hiring manager. And I think it requires kind of taking a little bit of a look inward at times that people are
Mhm.
afraid to do. The balance is I'm trying to coach them and how to be strategic and to tell their story, but also not give them the answers because we want to make sure that they show up as their true, authentic selves. But I go back to some of those recordings that I take from candidates. I was documenting and transcribing candidate calls way before AI. That was my data lake. I didn't have AI tools to do that, but luckily I'm an incessant note taker, so it served me well. But I would often go to a candidate and say, here's what I heard from you. Here's the
Mhm.
story that I got when we spoke candidly and casually. And here's what I'm hearing now as you prepare for this interview and the story you're about to tell. And I really try to hone in on what the gap is. Here's the in between that I'm not hearing, and here's where I think you're
Mhm.
missing that part of telling your story. And that's where the magic is. 100%. That is where it is because oftentimes, and I'm this happened in my own career. People see things in you that you might not see in yourself.
Mhm.
Never thought I'd be sitting in a recruiting seat, but someone said, you'd be really good at this. And I threw my head back and laughed, and here I am.
Here
So
you are.
it's in between that I think we have to be able to kind of, mirror and see in ourselves. And sometimes that takes somebody else. I tell people, candidates especially, go ask the five closest people to you, friends, family members, what are the things that stand
Yeah.
out about you? And weave that into your story, to your resume, to all the things that are going to be in front of a hiring manager.
So, I'm sure that work is fascinating, and there's just so much. Um, you just get so much yourself from bringing out somebody else's story and helping them tell their best version of themselves that none of us are usually very
Yeah.
good at. Let's flip the tables here a minute and have you kind of opine on how leaders need to be thinking about their engagement in the conversation. And I mean, you were just kind of mentioning it a little bit, but I know that, you've shared with me that your own career trajectory has happened because people saw potential in you that a machine they wouldn't have done. And so what's your message to leaders who are wanting to make a huge impact in their companies and need the right people at the table? What do they need to be doing in the conversation to share the story of the company and the role, but also draw it out of the person that they're talking to if they haven't, had a Jessica session.
Yeah. So those interviews that I observed were not just to get candidate insights. Those interviews that I observed also showcase the fact that as business leaders, we are often not great interviewers. And so I would say lean into trying to be a better interviewer. Overall, I think being able to come into a conversation organically and connect with someone can tell you so much more than those five interview questions that you did a web search for before you hopped on the interview. And I see a lot of that. Really think about what you need to know about a person to understand if they can be successful in the position. Obviously, we're asking questions about competency, we're asking questions about technical capabilities, and those things are very important. But when you're in the weeds with somebody and you've got a problem to solve or something goes awry, you're really going to see where the true work gets done. And so I say find a way to test those kinds of scenarios. Talk about, the last time they had a problem that they weren't able to solve. What happened? What was the outcome? What did you do? Ask
Mhm.
them how they felt about it. Were you, feeling like you needed to start from the beginning? Were you feeling like you needed to bring others into the conversation? You learn so much about the approach that somebody might take too. So I think non-traditional questions is my first guidance point. Think about what else you can ask, going back to my quip from earlier. What else can we kind of lean into?
What else is there?
Right. And look at what you have already about the candidate, meaning, do you have a test that they've taken for predictive indexing or a personality screening, or maybe HR did a phone screen first or a recruiter did a phone screen first? Look into those insights and try to go one layer deeper into something that you've already discovered that either you like or maybe you have a little caution around. Those are also, big, big revelations often. Candidates will tell a story that they like because they're proud of an outcome. Dig deeper. What made them so proud about it? Was that they solved the issue, or was it that you had a big group of, stakeholders that jumped in with you and you worked better as a team? There's just insights there that I don't think we're really exploring deep enough. And spend a little more time. with the candidates that you do like. You know, we try to fit a lot into a 30-minute interview or a 45-minute interview. You don't see a lot of hour-long interviews, although a lot of interviews
Mm.
that are good will take that long because they
Yeah,
go over.
they go over.
If a candidate tells me, oh, the interview was scheduled for 30 minutes, but we talked for an hour, we talked for 45 minutes, that tells me something too.
Mhm.
And it's not always a positive, but a lot of times it is. It tells me that there was more to explore. And so I need to talk with the hiring manager and understand, you know, why they took a little bit longer. You know, maybe you really like the candidate, but they weren't for you. I think maybe, you know, exploring where a candidate could fit elsewhere in your organization is something that we underutilize. You know, there's not a lot of internal referrals that happen at a company, and there should be more of that.
Mhm.
What if you could find your next great candidate for another team through a failed interview of your own for a candidate that didn't work out? We don't do enough of that.
Mhm. It's so interesting as we kind of recap, and I've just so enjoyed this conversation. At the end of the day, your success as a business depends on the humans that you work with side by side at every single level of the organization. It's always about the people. That's what every leader says. That's what everyone says up and down the organization. That's why people stay because they like who they're working with. They like the purpose of the job that they're doing. And this is why they leave. I don't like the people. I don't like my manager, right? You quit a manager, not a company a lot of the time. So much of success in business comes down to the people, the team, the humans who come together to collaborate. And AI or any other technology is never going to erase, all of that. So, I think what we've talked about today is we've let AI go too far in keeping us from maybe really great potential humans that can't stand out in a keyword search or an AI just automatically declining people. Yeah, I think we've talked about how important AI can be in making you more effective, more efficient, more scalable. Put it in the right spot and take it out of the wrong spots. I think at the end of the day is kind of what we're saying, and allow those gray areas, as you so eloquently said, to continue to bubble up and figure out how your systems don't prevent you
Mhm.
from seeing people who might make all the difference in your team, in your organization, in your success, and your ability to serve your customers, and your ability to provide returns to your shareholders, all these things, right? And so I just really appreciate kind of your insights. As we wrap, is there anything we didn't cover that you'd really like to make sure we share with the audience?
I just really want to convey that as a whole in hiring, let's just stop screaming into the algorithmic void, so to speak, and try to find better ways that we can hone in on real conversations together. And that's a challenge. It's not an easy answer on how to do that. Like I said, I don't have the answer on how to make it right. But I do know that we need to lean in more to that connection and stop allowing just the tools to talk to one another. Let's jump in and actually be part of that conversation. Yeah.
That's it. And that's why I call this podcast Lead the Machine. Don't let it lead you. And I feel like it's kind of leading us a little bit too much on this so important topic that just it is a make or break for companies. So, as always, this is meant to be a dialogue. Please share your thoughts about Jessica and I's conversation and what experiences that you've had, both trying to find work and also trying to find the next great team member, and where you think we can improve and redirect AI in some ways. So, we'll look forward to all of that and see you all on the next episode. Thank you so much. Thanks, Jessica.
Thank you.